All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Wiegand. I am the co-founder and chief growth officer at Shift 5. Shift 5 is a relatively new company, only about 2 years old. It was founded by members of the Department of Defense and the intelligence community that banded together to solve a really unique, but I think really exciting problem that we face right now, and that is defending our weapons platforms and other critical infrastructure, think transportation systems. So first, I just want to talk to you guys about my favorite movie, and that is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. So, many of you have probably seen the Steve Martin, John Candy get together for a pretty hilarious comedy where they try and make it across the country using various types of transportation. And I like to talk about planes, trains, and automobiles because the only thing that my mom remembers what we do at Shift 5 is that we defend planes, trains, and tanks. And so this is a pretty cool, cool space to operate in, but what brings all of these systems together and makes them, from my perspective as an ex-cyber officer in the Army, what makes them all in many ways identical, or all part of a similar class or facility? Well, when we look under the hood, we see that whether we're talking an Abrams tank, a F-35, or a diesel-electric passenger locomotive like you just saw, all of these complex weapons platforms and transportation platforms share embedded computers, typically referred to as line replaceable units in our, in the DoD. And these embedded computers all communicate with one another, but they don't generally communicate over the traditional network architectures, TCP/IP, Ethernet, fiber that we see deployed in the IT space. They deploy over some really unique, ultra-redundant, and very reliable data bus technologies. Some of my favorite are MIL Standard 1553, actually Shift 5's namesake. If any of you are nerds out there and have heard of the ASCII chart, the Shift key and the 5 key are decimal 15 and 53. So now you have our engineering shibboleth and can get hired to come work for us. But when we look at a modern weapon system, and this is taken out of a GAO report, so nothing classified here, you see some of the complexity represented here by different generic subsystems that's represented. All of these systems have to come together and communicate in a very controlled way, and typically on data bus architectures that require some type of real-time promise that messages are going to be delivered according to a schedule, so that, for example, one LRU taking up potentially a bunch of communications time on a data bus to another LRU doesn't prevent critical messages from flight controls getting to the ailerons and making the aircraft operate sluggishly. So these network architectures, 1553, A-Ring 429, 717, normal serial protocols many of you have probably encountered decades ago, RS-232, 422, 485. These are the things, along with CAN bus, that underpin all of our weapons platforms, CAN bus, the cars and trucks that we drive every single day, and many of the transportation platforms that conduct safety-critical functions across our society and often are carrying our most precious cargo, people. So the challenge that we face today, and that I'm here to talk about, is that many of our weapons platforms, and you can genericize this to just legacy systems in general, are completely unmonitored from cyber attack. So what does that mean? If we think about the risk management framework that NIST offers us as a way to think about how we defend cyber terrain, we can't see ourselves today when it comes to weapons platforms. We have no way of actively monitoring to know, do we have clean software and firmware configurations across all of those embedded computers that are the organs under the skin and under the armor of our weapons platforms, right? We have no internal continuous monitoring. We do not have effective mechanisms to push software and firmware updates from industry through our maintenance procedures, whether that's some type of over-the-air update like you get on a Tesla car today, or whether it is you taking your car to the dealer and they plug in a jack and update some software to make your console operate correctly, or whether it is a line maintainer at an infantry unit at Fort Hood who is conducting his motor stables in the morning on Monday, and he's pulling fault codes and making sure that all the software is up to date across his vehicle fleet. We don't have a mechanism today on the vast majority of our weapon systems to ensure that any software and firmware updates only came from the OEM and are part of an approved configuration that was released after thorough safety assessments by program managers. I think most critically, as a former mechanized infantry officer, somebody who rode around on Bradley fighting vehicles, crew and maintainers and by abstraction commanders have no indications, alerts, or warning that there is any type of cyber compromise of any of the cyber terrain within their weapon systems today. So how can a pilot, let's take an Apache attack helicopter pilot, for example, how can a pilot today in that airframe discern if he's looking at a maintenance anomaly or a cyber attack when he sees an advisory caution or warning light blinking on his dashboard to let him know that one of his subsystems has failed? Or he can't. Now, this is not a problem that's unique to DoD. Today, none of us can answer the same question if an engine control unit or our head units in our cars and automobiles were subject to the same type of attack. So, these indications, alerts, and warnings are absolutely crucial, especially when we're facing off against adversaries that don't respect, the traditional kind of timeline of war. Whereas here in the United States, we may place restrictions on ourselves when it comes to access operations and pre-positioning different types of effects code on foreign weapon systems until, we're in some stage of conflict with them. We know that many of our adversaries who bank on asymmetric and hybrid warfare techniques, using cyber to deny, degrade, disable, manipulate, or in some cases even destroy weapons platforms, we know that they don't play by the same rules. In fact, many of our adversaries look at how we impose the law of armed conflict on the way that we conduct cyber operations, and they realize that they have an advantage against us. And so fortunately, the previous administration, the one before, have come out with some pretty stern warnings to the international community saying, hey, listen, cyber attacks against certain critical infrastructure, especially in DoD, can be met with kinetic force. But, I think that many in the know would question if we've really kind of driven that point home in any type of example scenario yet. And then finally, when it comes to weapons platforms, we don't have full data capture. The Georgia TAG this morning, the general discussed CPT 170, that cyber protection team that has been deployed several times up to Fort Meade to go assist the Army Cyber Command with defensive operations of critical military infrastructure. Today, if that cyber protection team were to be deployed to go look at a traditional legacy weapons platform and do incident response, or let's say that we identified some critical military weapon systems that we wanted to pre-position forces, we want to do an active hunt operation and make sure that somebody isn't coming in proactively. Today, they can't roll up to most weapons platforms and use their existing material or equipment to get even raw data from it. And if they could pull raw data using data acquisition solutions that the R&D community would use, they wouldn't be able to make sense of it. So this is the current state of weapon system cybersecurity, and nothing that I'm telling you right now is necessary, new, or novel. All right, so Congress has recognized this problem for several years and has legislated on it almost annually since 2016 through the NDAA, when they looked at every single service in the eye and they said, and enshrined in law, hey, we want you to do a comprehensive cyber assessment, a resiliency assessment of all of your ACAT-1 and critical legacy platforms, and we want you to report back to us. We're going to give you 3 years to do it. 3 years later, the services came back and said, hey, that was a really tough task. It turns out we didn't have all of the intellectual capital within the services or within our defense industrial base to get all of it done, so here's our kind of C solution. We did reports on about 70% of it. And the results summarizing here are that the vast majority of our weapons platforms underpinned by OT serial data bus architectures are completely vulnerable and unmonitored. All unclassified, all out in the open, right? And some of the reasons, here we just discussed on the previous slide. So this is the really exciting challenge that I get to step into and work on every day. And I think that this is a really fun problem to work because not only is there an opportunity to solve problems in DoD, enable our defenders so that they can monitor critical infrastructure, enable our warfighters so that they can understand what their cyber key terrain looks like within their weapons platforms and take proactive actions or reactive actions to reconstitute weapon systems. But additionally, this is a really exciting use case that provides awesome opportunities to translate solutions in defense over to the commercial industry. And the reason for that is that many of the solutions that underpin our weapons platforms are commercial and off the shelf. So looking at Army ground combat platforms, for example, because of some very good reasons, leveraging scalability, leveraging economies of scale and cost reductions, many of our ground combat platforms use commercial off-the-shelf components, use commercial engines, controllers, and other embedded computers that allow us to better support, sustain, and offer capabilities at a price that we can afford, and in a support model that is advantageous to the warfighter. Because of this commonality, solutions that are brought to the defense market easily port over to their commercial respective verticals. In the challenges that I just discussed in defense are the same when we're talking commercial aviation, when we're talking commercial rail, ground vehicles, both on and off-road, anything from mining, oil, gas, to on-road trucking, et cetera. A lot of the technologies, a lot of the standards employed are identical. And so there's a tremendous opportunity to pick up and address issues in both markets. And so that's what I'm fortunate to be involved in doing today. So what I'd like to do is just take you under the skin, if you will, of a diesel-electric locomotive. You know, we're here in Georgia, and only a few miles away is one of the largest bump yards in the Northeast, managed by the Norfolk Southern Railroad. A massive amount of economic value and cargo goes through that yard every single day. And it's pushed around on GE and EMD locomotives. Those locomotives share a lot of similarities with this passenger locomotive that you see here. So what is a locomotive? Well, at the end of the day, you have a giant prime mover, a huge diesel engine right in the middle, and this thing is producing about 1 megawatt of energy. That's enough to power about 10,000 homes. That's a lot. In the back, you have a separate generator set that provides power to all the cars, the consist. And then up in the front, we have a bunch of electronics that enable everything to work correctly. Locomotives take diesel energy fuel. They turn that into mechanical shaft motion that is used to generate electricity. That electricity flows to the wheels, and it helps accelerate and dynamically brake the vehicle. When we look at a diesel-electric locomotive, I think about all of the cyber systems, all of the embedded control systems that have to come together to make something like this operate, right? I mean, we're talking about 100 tons with the ability to accelerate and decelerate a massive amount of mass behind it to about 60 miles an hour, and do so repeatedly, especially in a commuter sense where you're just hitting stations continuously. So under the hood, the primary subsystems, the primary computers that are involved in making this phenomenal machine operate are engine control modules for both of our diesel engines. These are full authority digital engine controlled, exactly like many of our cars and like almost all of the turbines that power our commercial aviation assets today. A train management computer up here in the high voltage cabinet behind that operator. This is basically the brain of the machine. It ties all these different subsystems together. It reads messages from the operator's controls, understands what that operator wants to do, and then uses it to control all the other subsystems to accelerate, decelerate the train, etc. It's monitoring for faults, and it has a tremendous amount of data that it's monitoring also to identify different anomalous conditions that the operator should be informed of so he can take appropriate action. And then up in the nose, we've got a data recorder. It's a large transportation asset. This is a required solution exactly like planes. Also, all locomotives today are required to have a positive train control system. All right, this is basically another set of computers and radios that are installed up on the nose of the train and communicate with a series of radios along the tracks to make sure that trains don't collide into one another. This was in response to a terrible mishap out in California in 2008 where almost 30 people died in a horrendous collision. Some of you might remember. So that was a congressionally mandated safety feature that has now been implemented across the entire Class 1 freight and passenger rail space here in North America. This is cyber key terrain, or the military term for crown jewels. If an adversary were to get malware or firmware onto any one of these systems, they could control, in most cases, physical outcomes on the locomotive. What do I mean by that? Well, if you can modify the firmware or software on an engine control unit for a diesel electric, for a large prime mover like you have here, you can control the RPM speed, you can control the amount of fuel that's being ingested. There's a lot of really interesting and some might say exciting, depending on where you stand on the research angle, things you can do with that engine. Causing an engine failure or overspeeding a diesel engine is a known kind of issue with these engine control units and modules, but not one that I think has really entered the public conscious. So this is cyber key terrain because this affects the mobility of the platform, but it also provides an adversary some type of lever, if you will, that they could use to commit damage to physical systems. And damage to one of these systems in certain physical situations, like the train in the Hudson Tunnel, could be a pretty bad day, especially for passengers. If there's smoke coming out, this could be a serious issue. I don't think I need to belabor anymore, the necessity of protecting control systems and whatnot. When we look at locomotives or when we look at weapon systems, we at Shift 5 follow a process that was pioneered by our national labs and the FFRDC community to set up a series of system engineering analytic methods that allow us to take a look at all the subsystems below the surface of a given asset and break it into specific components that allow us to judge what is the risk to operation if an adversary were to compromise this and the access vectors that they can use to get to it. And from that, we can inform a customer where a security monitoring solution needs to be employed so we can fix that, firstly, that lack of observability, and ultimately bake in intrusion prevention mechanisms into platforms. So I won't belabor any of this because I think that this is a pretty standard process. But the reason that I go through this specific commercial example is because this is an unclassified demonstration, if you will, or a quick overview of the types of electronic systems that are often forgotten by our CISOs and our IT security teams in corporate America and previously across the Defense Department. When we look to cyber defenders today, my first point to the crowd is to make sure that we are looking comprehensively across all of the assets within an organization's portfolio. This presentation couldn't come, I think, any better than on the heels of the CISA presentation that you just received, because what we're finding and what I hope to share with AFCEA today is that there is an incredible amount of latent and we believe growing risk with unmonitored and unsecured critical assets in both defense and across commercial industries. The question today to many boards in corporate America is, whose responsibility is it to defend all of these onboard systems? Does that fall within the IT department? It doesn't sound like it. They don't do anything with a locomotive. Does it fall to the operations and maintenance team? They seem to swap and handle all of that out, but they don't have any experience with cybersecurity. Security to a corporate board might sound like, well, we need to bring our chief of police in, but that's physical security. The point is that many organizations are just starting to grapple with this question. And in addition to the natural tension between who owns this responsibility within a corporate enterprise is who owns this responsibility across the supply chain within a particular commercial vertical. Is the cybersecurity of these assets under the hood of the locomotive the responsibility of the OEM? Or is it the responsibility of the operator? So these are unanswered questions today, and fortunately, I'm not here to tell you that there has been any cyber attack against rail assets. We're attempting to get ahead of that, but these are questions that I hope that you can take back to your respective communities and ask the appropriate question to get that conversation started. So the current state of play, if you will, with securing our planes, trains, and tanks across the nation is kind of like you see these characters here. It's uncertain really who owns the responsibility for these OT assets. And additionally, there is unfortunately few market solutions being offered by OEMs or by independent operators to solve the observability problem and pull data back. But the good news is that, working with our federal partners, we have actually found that there is a really exciting opportunity when you do attempt to solve and address this problem. And it's one that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to spend globs and globs of money on a defensive solution, which, candidly, some, especially in the commercial industry, are going to ask. And I think the very real question of, well, how much should we spend and what is the risk? Because we haven't seen an example of an attack against an airliner in flight or a train on the rails. So the second thing I hope to get across to the AFCEA crowd today is that working with the Department of Defense, we have found that there is a dual value proposition when you solve cybersecurity observability problems on your OT assets. And the big takeaway is that in order to monitor all of the data flowing across internal networks and ensure that there is no anomalous activity, there's no data injection, that you have clean and known configurations of firmware and software resident on these platforms, when you do that, by very nature, you have to install a pretty sophisticated data acquisition and edge computing solution that can monitor for all of this stuff, no matter what the network connectivity is to the vehicle. What do I mean by that? We when we defend locomotives, install a small computer that taps into all of the onboard data buses, soaks all of the data up, and continuously and in real time on the platform runs different rules and signatures, basically employing all the best practices from 20 plus years of intrusion detection and antivirus protection. But all of this designed and built specifically for the embedded protocols under the skin on these weapons platforms. But by doing all of that, we also have this incredible faculty to pull all of this data out and to provide it to operators and maintainers. And this is where the trick is. In many cases, when you want to get ahead of a threat and there isn't an external compliance reason to spend dollars to defend something, you have to go to the operations and maintenance side of the house, the people in corporate enterprises that are responsible for revenue generation. And you can pitch to them really two things that they'll respond to. Hey, I can help you generate more revenue, or I can help you reduce your costs. And let's be honest, nobody really likes to talk about spending more money on a defensive solution, especially when the risk quantification is so challenging. And so that's the promise that we have really found here, is that when you look at solving the OT cybersecurity problem on weapons platforms and on commercial assets, there's a dual value proposition. You can effectively increase the safety and security and resiliency of a weapons platform and simultaneously provide incredible value to operations and maintenance teams by unlocking and freeing all of this latent data from underlying systems that generally have not been enriched and provided full force to their teams. What do they do with that? They help them make systems more efficient, reducing fuel, reducing emissions, using all of this data to build a data lake so that they can train predictive models, starting to build digital twinning solutions. You name it. It is phenomenal to me, the scope of challenge before program managers in defense who have never had a faculty to pull back operational data across all of their fleets in a coherent and consistent way. And this challenge also bedevils commercial enterprise in nearly every vertical that we've looked at. So I hope to leave you with that good news story. There is a way to, again, improve the safety, resiliency, and security of systems while also reducing costs and providing potentially revenue-generating opportunities for commercial enterprise. And with that kind of message, we can get after these problems and install monitoring solutions and intrusion detection and intrusion prevention solutions in critical infrastructure where there might not be the appetite to do so until, unfortunately, something bad happens. So, team, that concludes my presentation. Feel free to look me up. I'll be in the back as well in case any of you guys would like any sidebars. Thank you so much.